Uh-oh.
Okay.
Okay, here we are. Hello, everyone.
Yay.
Hello. Oh man, I'm really glad all the attractive people stayed to hear us speak today. That was my best case scenario. This is going to be so fun. Thank you guys so much for being here. My name is Ashley C. Ford. Our lovely panelists today, Tananarive Dew, S.A. Cosby, Victor LaValle. We're just going to have a fun conversation. Yeah, please clap for them.
And for Ashley.
Thank you.
Gotta do a photo.
Oh man, this is going to be so much fun to me. I'm so glad to be here. There are so many Capricorns here who are part of the artist situation. I'm also a January 7th birthday, so happy birthday to us. We're gonna have a fun time. So I would like to start with you, Victor, actually. So one of the things that we're talking about today here, obviously the big theme here is Black horror. And when I read some of your work, The Ballad of Black Tom, The Changeling, there is this extremely, when you write these scenes, the extreme visceral reaction as a reader is uncommon. What do you think it is about Black horror that invites people in, not just to the psyche, but the body?
Wow, that's a great question. Well, number one, I appreciate that would be how it feels, right? And I would say that, like, maybe what I do try to do is embody each scene as fully as possible, as visually as possible, as viscerally as possible, so that the reader does feel like they are in the body that is experiencing the scene, you know? Maybe so much to the point, like any scene that happens in a book, I act out the scene wherever it, you know, birth on a subway, I act out some version of that, getting your throat chained to a radiator, I act out a version of that, because what I find is there's all these elements that you would never think would be a part of a moment like that, a sound on the street, a smell, whatever it might be, that maybe makes it pop that much more, and I take that into the work. And my hope is then, for both of those books, for all my books, I guess, is also occurring in a Black body, you know. So I think that there's also a way that it also plugs into different histories that I hope echo in a certain way, or ring a bell in a certain way, without necessarily explicitly making that statement.
Right.
But I think for hopefully any reader who understands those histories, they will see the way that's a part of it, even as it isn't explicitly stated that it's a part of it. And then the people who don't see it there, hopefully they just enjoy a good scare, but that there's another layer of meaning, if you do know.
Right.
You know.
Right, which is my experience, I have to say, would be in like, oh, that was scary as hell. It also did, hold on, wait a minute. Am I being intellectually stimulated at the same time? I love that, and I love that about your work. Tananarive, one of the things that I love about your work specifically is the idea of a haunting, and how a haunting can happen, how a haunting can appear in the life of a person. I also, growing up in Black communities, growing up taking in Black literature, Black media, I find that when it comes to horror, the haunting is something that, when we're taking it to that cerebral area, when we are really thinking about it even outside of the body, though it always eventually includes the body, it starts with that idea of a haunting. Can you talk a little bit about the haunting and Black horror?
I love that word haunting that you keep saying over and over again.
Sorry, I can't help it.
Because we think of hauntings as places, but when it comes to Black history, it's haunted moments very often, right? I mean, sometimes they're rooted in places, like a rosewood that's burned to the ground and almost erased from history. But there's just so much individual trauma, family hauntings, right? Things that people don't talk about. things that we try to bury and keep from our children, not realizing that it's in the air they're breathing. We don't have to talk about our trauma. They know we had trauma because we won't hug them. Or my mother knew that she felt uncomfortable about being touched. And I don't know the whole backstory to that. I know there was a backstory. I don't know what it was, but she worked very hard to prevent passing that on to the next generation. So a lot of what I'm writing, like for instance, my novel that's coming out later this year, finally, The Reformatory, is based on the Dozier School in Marianna, Florida. The same setting really as Colson Whitehead's Nickel Boys. That's not how I planned it, but that's how it worked out. And that represents a family haunting to me because I had a great uncle who died there in 1937. I don't think my mother ever knew she had an uncle who died there. It was one of those family secrets. But now that helps me understand why her father might have been physically abusive to my grandmother because he lost his brother at the age of 15 to the state, incarceration basically. So what I'm trying to do is delve into those personal hauntings and manifest them outwardly, to take it from sort of just a personal experience to let's make this a haunted reformatory.
Right.
And let's let these ghosts represent the violence in the story, because I can't write a novel. My son was about 12 when I started writing this book. Holy cow. He's 19 now. But I couldn't write a novel where I was just beating up children or sexually abusing children. A lot of that happened, and I want to honor that violent history. But at the same time, I mean, horror is entertainment, I think, really at its core. So find ghosts as a way to sort of stand in for that violence and make the novel about something else. Make the novel about the moment perhaps this child realizes that it's not the ghosts that are the scariest part of this place, and how do I get the hell out of here? And create examples of how to confront our fears and confront our traumas through the prism of fantasy.
When you talk about the haunting of a family members, of those moments that are not spoken of, the regret, that makes me think essay of Razorblade Tears, and specifically because this is not necessarily horror, but these characters are haunted. How have you found bringing in this element of haunting into a book that is not necessarily put on the shelf with other horror books?
It's funny you say that, because the next book I have coming out is a Southern Gothic serial killer murder mystery. Ooh. And yeah, I'm excited. But I think what you were saying about the haunting, there's this great quote by Flannery O'Connor where somebody has asked her, is the South Christ-centered? And she's like, I don't know if it's Christ-centered, but it's Christ-haunted. And it's haunted by hypocrisy. It's haunted by the idea evangelicals who shout to the heavens about God and brotherhood, but don't want black people to come and sit in their church. And so for me, when I write about the South is a haunted land, Yeah. The South is bloodstained. Every scrap of land that I walk on, somebody who looks like me has bled there and died there. And so when you talk about a character like Ike in Razorblade Tears, his whole identity, his masculinity, his sense of self is defined by this sort of, I will not be subdued, I will not submit. And he doesn't understand that his son, who's gay, that he doesn't have to share that masculinity. He doesn't have to pass that generational trauma on to him. And unfortunately, Ike doesn't understand that until his son dies. And so I think the sense of haunting, of generational trauma, of a family history, we pass those things down. Violence is a haunting. If your father or mother was violent with you, you're going to be violent with your children. And so I think, especially, not just because I'm from the South, but especially writing about the South, the South is full of ghosts. Both, human and otherwise. And so I think for me as a writer, part of what I want to do is confront those ghosts. I want to talk about them. In the book I got coming out this year, All the Sinners Bleed, the town itself is haunted by a history of blood. There's a prologue, which should tell you don't write prologues, but I was like, if Dennis Lehane can write one, I can write one. So, and so there's, in the prologue, I talk about how this town was founded in 1789, and there was an indigenous tribe there that was murdered, and then there was a suicide pact that happened, and there was a family that drowned in a river, and so these things become a cumulative effect, and you could feel it. I feel it in my hometown. One of my favorite things when I was a kid, my mother would tell me these horrible true crime stories of stuff that happened when she was a little girl, and I would just eat that stuff up. And so I think it was a way for her to process it and try to understand it. And then as a writer, I'm trying to understand it for myself, but also for my readers.
I understand that. My grandmother was the same way. She told me a lot and also took me to some pretty inappropriate movies. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of the film Fire in the Sky.
Yeah.
Yeah, my grandma took me to see that in the theaters. I was 6. It's about a man who's abducted and tortured in space. Mm-hmm. I mean, every time I saw the moon, I cried for like a year. And I wondered why that happened. And, Victor, that makes me actually want to come to you because I love your books, right? But I'm 36 years old. I have met in the past 2 years, especially when I've been back in Indiana, quite a few young people who really like your books. People who are between the ages of, I would say, probably 16 and 22. Okay. Who are big fans of Victor LaValle's writing. When we are writing about horror, when we're writing about trauma, when we are writing about the haunting of the human spirit, how do we write that in such a way that it touches the people who it is intended for? And do you have intentions for who your work reaches?
Well, number one, I'm just thrilled to hear that anyone under my age is enjoying the books. So that's a gift. But what it makes me think of a little bit maybe is this is many, many years ago, more than a decade ago. I remember my wife and I, we were passing through a children's editor, like it was like a writing, literary conference in a hotel in Manhattan. And I happened upon a panel of 5 YA editors, and they were talking, and they said to the audience, they said, somebody asked, what can I send to you? What sells to your audience, kind of thing. And I remember distinctly this one editor saying, if you want to write about the hardest things in life, the most frightening and scary things in life, write them for teenagers. And they said the reason for that is because teenagers know the world is scary, but what they also know is that lots of people try to tell them it isn't. Lots of people try to lie to them. And one of the reasons that YA books sometimes tackle stuff that most adult books won't touch is because younger readers, let's say 15, 14 to 20 years old, they're just dying for somebody to acknowledge that the things they have been going through or the things they have seen, whatever it is, that it's the truth, that it's not pretend, And that really stayed with me because I realized when I was a kid, the writers that I was drawn to, Clive Barker, Stephen King, Shirley Jackson, Lovecraft, for all his flaws, Edgar Allan Poe, were also people who I thought, in a certain way, I was getting to peek over the fence. And on that side, they were saying, yeah, people walk on a subway train, it goes to the wrong station, and they are flayed alive in a secret pit of hell or whatever. And I was like, that sounds like the 7 train. And it really meant the world to me to have that acknowledged. So if nothing else, just that part of things, I think the intention of just telling the truth to people through the books, and then the idea of finding people that age, kids that age, who appreciate that truth as a gift, and then finding people who are 80 years old who appreciate that truth is a gift. And just feeling like the intention is to tell those truths to the people who recognize it as truth. Because certainly there are some people who don't think the world is that way, and I'm happy they feel that way. But for all those who do feel that way, I feel like I want to tell them, I agree.
Right. Tananarive, like Victor, you are not just a writer, you are a teacher as well. And one of the things that I think of a lot when it comes to teaching is the fact that you have to move beyond just representation and get into something more specific, something that is more useful for the future. Because while representation is important, it's not enough. So when you were on stage earlier talking about your experience in work in TV and film, talking about horror noir, which I love and have watched many, many times. And if you haven't watched horror noir on Shudder, get on it. You'd love it. It's really fun to watch. It's like you're not just learning, you're having a good time. There are limits to representation. There are limits to what it can mean for us, not just as artists, but also as people who love art and who consume it. What do you think is the next step beyond representation that we can start expanding for artists of color to have not just the experience of seeing what is possible, of having books written that cater to them and their sensibilities, but also lets them know I can do that too. I could be the creator of this moment.
That is a mouthful. You're so good at that.
Truly,
Watching her.
truly.
Wonderful, yes.
All right, cool out.
What a great question. I hope I'm answering this the way the question is intended. But when you say to me, what's the next step beyond representation? Representation can be a white director and a white screenwriter casting a Project Black. And there are great examples of that. And I always appreciate it when I see Black characters as protagonists in anything. And there are some allies who have done great work in that realm. But the next step is ownership, and the next step is agency. You know, I do a lot of Zoom pitch meetings, and you can almost predict how that meeting is going to go by the faces on the other side of that Zoom. Wow. If I see a sister on the Zoom, that's exciting to me, you know? That is exciting because you have the advocate on the inside, but often she is not the most powerful person on the Zoom. Right. Or he, you know, which is, so that's where we need to go. We need to have more representation among the gatekeepers, the executives, the network presidents, the studio heads. There are really, really strong allies throughout Hollywood, but there are limitations to that allyship because deep down, like all of us, we want to know, how does this story reflect me? Right. Which ends up in Black projects then amplifying characters who are not Black and trying to find roles to ostensibly draw on the audience, but what they really want is they want to be drawn in. So, you know, a lot has happened since Get Out, a lot. A lot has happened since Black Panther, a lot has happened since the murder of George Floyd, but we've also lived long enough already to see it to start snapping back. Snapping back, because there are a lot of executives who weren't uncomfortable with these changes, who didn't feel included in these projects. So it's a fight. It's a fight for representation at the table, not just on the screen.
And I know that, Essay, some of those things you are going through at this point as well, with adaptations, with, you know, the Zoom business meetings. All of that is happening at such a wild level. And it's hard because I know myself personally, it's even, you know, that for writers, and especially Black writers, to get to that point is already so uncommon that it can be hard to prepare yourself and to think about how you want to show up in that moment, because it almost feels like wishing on a star to even make the plan in case it happens. So for you, what has been most helpful in navigating that? Like, who are you talking to? What are you doing to make sure that at the end of the day, these conversations are maybe informing you, they are an opportunity to learn, but they are not changing you.
It's so funny because when you ask a question like that, I feel like whatever I answer is going to sound like I'm name dropping. I've been very lucky that there are folks who came before me who I grew up reading and admiring, who have become friends and mentors to me. You know, and like for instance, when the film rights to Razorblade Tears sold, Walter Mosley called me. First of all, it's crazy that Walter Mosley has my cell phone number. That's insane. I'm a little poor Southern boy who grew up like climbing magnolia trees and and skinning deers for like making jerk meat for the winter. And now Walter Mosley texts me or calls me. And when he calls me, it's so funny because he's like, "Sean, it's Walter." I'm like, I know. I saved it. But one of the things he gave me a piece of advice was, he said, "Never forget that you're the myth maker. You're the creator. They need you more than you need them." He said, so when you go into that meeting, he said, don't be ashamed to ask for what you want. He said, because the reason they're taking the meeting is because they want what you have. And so for me, I grew up in the South, and my mom was very conservative, and so it was always like, don't talk about money, don't talk about love. And so when you're a black author, a black creative, because we have so few people who have made it to that level, if you don't find somebody to talk to, you're not going to know what to expect. You're not going to know what you can ask for, and you should ask for everything, When you go to those meetings, another thing Walter said to me, he said, you go in there and you take everything they told you couldn't have. Oh. And I was like, yeah, you damn right. Then you have the meeting and you're nervous as hell. It's like Jerry Bruckheimer sitting in the corner of the Zoom, not saying nothing, like staring at you like an owl for like 20 minutes. And so, but yeah, you need those mentors. You need those folks that can talk to you and talk to you intelligently. Like I'm very lucky to be friends with Walter Mosley, Kelly Garrett, who was a TV writer and a great author in her own right. Folks like that who reach out to you and say, hey, here's what you should be asking for. Here's what you want. And I wanted to touch on what you said to Ms. Dew, is that I think one of the advancements that when we go beyond representation is normalization. That it's not special that you have a black face behind the camera, in front of the camera. That it is a paradigm shift, that it becomes a matter of course. Yes, of course, Antoine Fuqua is directing this. Of course, Steve McQueen is producing this. Of course, Jonathan Majors wants to be in this. By the way, Jonathan Majors wants to be in my next book.
Oh my God! I would tell you where I want Jonathan Majors. We're somewhere. I'm gonna do it. Sorry, baby. You're the love of my life. I didn't mean that.
But no, I think I think you need those mentors, you need those friends, those people, around you who can give you advice, give you an idea of what to expect. Because if you don't, then you won't ask for what you deserve.
Absolutely.
Victor, now I have to ask you, also as an educator, a writer, a screenwriter at this point, you have so much going on, but I have to assume that you have people asking you questions every day about how to do what Victor LaValle does the way Victor LaValle does it. How do you explain, or how do you talk to them, not just about your experience, but also about how the possibilities for their own experience?
You'd be surprised. There's much fewer people than you think that I speak to at all in a day. So I do teach, and so I think the channel where maybe I'm most useful like that is students of mine, right, who are coming up and who we might talk about a book deal, like what's a good book deal look like? What can I ask for? What's my right to ask for? And to Sean's point, like your right is to ask for too much, and then the worst that happens is they say no, right? Like, but the sometimes the shock of asking for a thing like that you can ask is even its own lesson, right? Like just to talk with a student like that. So that's, I would say, the majority of the places where that happens will be emails from former students who I've stayed in touch with, who they say, I'm thinking about this agent, or I don't know which agent, and I'll say, think about these 3 people, and I'll write them an email to let them know. And since the screenwriting stuff is relatively newer. It's just been the last couple of years. I feel like I'm still figuring out how to bring folks in that way, and in particular, maybe trying to bring prose writers into TV and film writing because it pays so much better.
That part.
For this, you know,
Right.
this is such a minor story, but I just remember this very small thing. This film, 20 years ago, or something like 10, 15 years ago, I got this call saying like they're making this film and they need a writer like you, which meant a black writer from New York. There's a character who is supposed to be a black kid from New York who likes to write, and we basically just need, we want to show like a couple pages from his journal as the actor, Sean Connery, as the actor reads the line, you figure out which movie it is, but as he reads the lines of the character out loud at this like private school where this kid has gone to school, whatever, and we would like to hire you to write those lines to do it, you know? And so I had a meeting with the director and all this kind of stuff, and then I remember they said, so you'll know, and so they said, write it out, and you'll know if we use it, if at the premiere, when he gets to that scene, if we use it, you'll hear him read it, and if we don't use what you did, music will play while he's reading. And I was like, okay, I understand, and just spoiler, music played when they ran. But the real point of it was, the real point of all that is to just say, the work I did for that thing, for which I spent maybe a day, paid the same amount I got for my first book.
There it is.
And that was very painful. I didn't get paid a ton for my first book, but it was this amazing moment of me saying like, oh, I see, like that's the trade-off here, right? And then, but with time, I realized the next step after that is to say like, but can you also still find a way to be artistic within that? Because of course, getting paid a lot of money, but doing nothing you love is not worth it,
No.
right? So that's, on some level, some of what I try to communicate to those students, even on the writing side of things, the prose side of things, and then moving into this as they show, as students, especially more recent students, talk about being interested in that, then I'll say like, here's some people you might reach out to, here's some like, apply to this thing, I've started to hear this thing is good, that thing is good, apply to this writing fellowship, see if you can get in, I'll write you a letter, and it still, in some ways, it's still the same as being a teacher.
Right.
You know, but the amazing thing is to imagine, you know, another 10 years from now, there's maybe 10 more, just even 10 more folks, 10 more black folks are now in writers' rooms or writing films or whatever it is, making a living off of that, and just as importantly, telling their stories to the kind of audience you reach with that sort of platform, and then hopefully still writing the books that reach the people that want to dive deeper, you know, as you do in prose.
Absolutely.
Just real quick, to
Please
jump
do.
off of what he said. So when Raised Blade Cheese came out and did really well, my agent got some calls from people in Hollywood. They were like, do you want to write a script on spec? Do you want to, we'll tell you what you want to write, and then you'll write it for us. And I had already written an audio drama for Audible. So I kind of, you know, I downloaded Final Draft, which, talking about money, that's expensive.
It's
It's
expensive.
expensive.
Writer
Oh my
duet.
God.
Writer
Whoever
duet.
came with Final Draft, they are rolling in the dough. They got $10 bills for toilet paper because that thing is expensive. But anyway, I have a friend named Jordan Harper who's a TV writer. He's an author, wrote on The Mentalist and Gotham for years. And I was talking to him about this opportunity. And he said, well, here's the thing. What's the project? So the project was they wanted to take From Dusk to Dawn and update it with an all-black cast. And I was telling him about it. He says, well, I'd also told him about the book that I have coming out that I was working on called All the Sinners Bleed. He says, here's the thing I'm going to tell you. I've been in Hollywood for 15 years. You will make more money if you wait and write the script for your book than if you write this property that these people have. He says, and the thing about it is, you know, you're going to be able to tell your story the way you want to tell it. He says, you didn't get into writing books to have more bosses. And Hollywood is just a ton of bosses. And so I thought about what he said, and I was like, you know, I think you're right. So I passed on it. they were offering me a lot of money, and my poor wife was like, "Are you sure? Are you sure you want to pass on it? Because we're trying to build a house." And I'm like, I was like, "I think I am. I think I'm gonna pass on it." So fast forward a year later, when I get back home Wednesday, I have a meeting with Higher Ground Productions about buying the book.
President Obama's production.
Yeah.
So I say all that to say this, like what Victor said, and what we all have been saying. You know, I think the next step is ownership. It's creating your own stories, being involved in the process, getting paid. Because I mean, I love writing, but you know, we have bills they got to be paid.
Yes.
You know, I love creative freedom, but you know, light bills can't be paid with creative freedom.
No.
And so you've got to be able to stand your ground. And I think for me, like what Victor said, it's frightening sometimes. It's scary to say that, to say, you know what, I'm going to bet on myself.
Yes.
I'm going to bet on myself. But I think also you have nothing to lose. You know, you have nothing to lose. It's like the worst going to happen is like, oh, well, I'll just have to write something else. And I think you have to sort of have that confidence within yourself. Right. You know, and I think that's a part of the larger story. You know, we're talking about Black horror and talking about writing from that perspective. I think that's a part of it.
Self-trust?
Yeah, it's self-trust. It's this idea that we can do this. If you take a book like Salem's Lot, and the character of Mark Petrie, the 12-year-old kid in the book, you know, he has this, he's picked on at school and all these other things, but he's the one kid who understands, no, there are vampires here. Like, do y'all not get this? And everybody, all the adults, all the people that bullied him, all the people around him, he trusts himself. It's not even confidence. It's just the matter-of-fact understanding of that, I know these are monsters, I'm going to try to stop them. And I think that's something you can take for the rest of your life as a creative person, is you have to just matter-of-factly say, I'm going to trust myself.
And you know, one of the things that I really like about that idea of trusting yourself is also about trusting your taste and trusting your curiosity to lead you to the places that you naturally want to go, the things that naturally interest you, the things that pique your interest. And that makes me think, Tananarive, about horror noir. And about the fact that I've been a horror fan since I was a kid. I've always loved to read horror. I've always loved to watch horror. But it was not until I watched that documentary as a person in their 30s that I was like, oh my goodness, like this is a whole genre. I couldn't see the whole picture, the whole context until I saw it all together in that documentary. And it makes me wonder about this moment for Black writers who are writing in these genres, horror, suspense, thriller, crime. When you're writing in that place, I feel like right now is such a good time to dive in, to jump in, to take the chance and say, I think this will be on somebody's radar and could be really good for me. But I don't write horror, and I don't write suspense, and I don't, write thrillers. That's something that I love. I'm a fan. I did the Lovecraft Country Radio podcast, and that was a ton of fun, but you're in it. Do you think now is an especially good time for writers of colors to jump in and say, we belong here, and trust themselves about their ability to make it happen?
I would say absolutely. I love talking about this moment we're in. I'm practically an evangelist about the impact that Jordan Peele has had on horror, and not just for Black creators. I mean, he really did help open the eyes to Hollywood that marginalized creators have stories to tell rooted in their own cultures that are different. And that's why I think horror is special as a genre, because it really does thrive on novelty. As many times as we've seen reboot after reboot after reboot, as a horror fan, there is nothing more interesting to me than something I have never seen before. A demon manifestation in a way I've never seen it done, an image I've never seen, a theme I've never seen. And that is part of the value of opening your doors and letting a lot of different people into the room. And I think that's why Get Out made $250 million. It's about a cultural conversation, but done in a way that was different.
Right.
So I'm forever telling prose writers, how many of you are prose writers out there? I think it's very, very valuable to study screenwriting. Not just because you want to work in Hollywood, because there are a whole lot of reasons not to want to work in Hollywood, despite everything that's been said here. Not everybody has the temperament. I remember I ran into, I don't think she would mind me telling her this story, I ran into Terry McMillan at a party, Waiting to Exhale, How Stella Got Her Groove Back. She was the example of an author who had had her work adapted to the screen, the only one I knew at that time. And I ran into her in a party, all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. I'm gonna move to LA, we're gonna break into Hollywood. She held me by my shoulders, pulled me forward and said, "Don't do it." And I was kind of crushed, right? But now I get it. It's not, working in Hollywood is not for everybody. Because there is a lot of BS. There's a lot, I mean, there are some rude business practices like ghosting that is just a common practice and that you would never accept in any other industry. But, but writing screenplays, not only does it help you learn how to be a more visual storyteller and use more visual symbols in your writing, and really, story structure may be the best reason to learn screenwriting because so many MFA programs underteach story structure, and maybe sometimes screenwriting overteaches story structure, so blend those two things together, and I think you have a better rounded writer. But the other reason is when Hollywood comes knocking, as they will, you know, they say, hey, someone wants to option your book. Someone wants to option your short story. If you've already written a spec script of that book or that short story, I mean, it may never get produced. You may never get farther than that first sale, right? But it gets you that seat at the table if you want it. Because even a bad script is closer to being a movie than a book, right? It's a template. All scripts are just templates, trust me. You are not writing that movie. You are writing a template for that movie, and you'll be just as surprised at how it turned out as the audience will be by the end. But there are so many reasons to study screenwriting right now, and horror is a very open, traditionally it's a very open field for newcomers, new filmmakers, unknown actors. It's an entry point. You don't have to spend a lot of money very often. All you need is some woods, right? and so I think that's why it's a very open area for newcomers to come in, and that includes you. So it's a beautiful moment. And I do look forward to that moment where it isn't a big deal, where the protagonist in this new horror movie is black, and they survive, and they have agency, and they're not fulfilling any of these tropes, because that's just what we expect now.
It's going to require a lot of self-trust
Yes.
on the part of the artist. Guys, in just a moment, we're going to take questions from the audience. I'm going to ask one more question. It's going to be for all three panelists before we come to you for questions. So be thinking of them now. I only have one rule about questions, which is that you have to ask a question. If you have something that's more of a comment than a question, then I'm going to ask you to hold on to that within yourself and find a better time to ask. Here today, we're just going to do questions, okay? So let's start with you, Victor. I would love to know, and this is obviously a question for everyone, what do you have going on next that you are really excited for people to see?
Well, probably the thing that will be out the soonest is my next novel is coming out, should be late March. It's called Lone Women. It's about...
Oh, yeah.
It's about...
I'm waiting for this one.
It's set in 1915 in Montana, and it's about lone women homesteaders in the territories, in particular about a black woman homesteader named Adelaide Henry, who leaves her family's farm in California, Southern California, and flees to Montana, and all she brings with her is a giant steamer trunk.
Yeah.
And some bad things happen in Montana.
You don't say.
Yes.
As they are wont to do
As
in a
they
Victor
do.
LaValle novel,
Yes.
which is why we love you. How about you, S.A. Cosby?
Okay, so I have three things that I'm gonna say real quick.
Tell us.
So one, I have a book coming out in April with Questlove. It's a time fiction, a time travel science fiction young adult novel called The Rhythm of Time. So that comes out April 7th. My next book from Flatiron, All the Sinners Bleed, comes out June 6th. All the Sinners Bleed is a story of Titus Crown. He's the first black sheriff in a small southern town. On the 1-year anniversary of his election, there's a shooting at the high school. A teacher is killed by a former student. The former student is then in turn killed by his deputies. And in investigating the crime, he finds out the teacher, the student, and a third person were a trio of serial killers. And so he has to discover who the third person is, while he's also dealing with a far-right group that's trying to hold a parade in his town. So that comes out June 6th. I'm really excited about that. It's funny about that, like, the one thing, my editor, I write all these crime novels before that, with a lot of violence, people getting shot and stuff like that. And I did this one, and my editor was like, there's a lot of people getting their face cut off in this. Like, could we scale it back? And I was like, well, it worked for Thomas Harris, so. And then finally, I have a audio drama coming out on Audible. It's an 8-episode audio drama called Broke Down Profits. It's the story of 3 grifters out of New York City who run afoul of the Russian mob, and so they try to escape to South Carolina. And at one point, somebody gets a bucket of snakes thrown on them. What the exciting thing about that is, on the plane coming down, I got the cast list from the producer. Jonathan Majors is the lead. Brian Tyree Henry is the supporting character, and Glenn Turman plays the character as well. So that's coming out.
Y'all not tired of him taking my money? Why y'all clapping?
And I'm
gonna be broke again.
And the last thing, I'm working currently on a screenplay, tentatively titled "Everybody Has a Plan." It's about an MMA fighter. It's sort of like Good Will Hunting meets Warrior, and it's about this kid who's a MMA prodigy, but he wants to be an artist. And so I'm tentatively working on that now. So.
Nice.
Wow.
It's amazing.
I was eating popcorn just listening to these.
Right?
So this year, I'm not mature enough to know my dates. I don't have my dates memorized. But in March, sometime, my second short story collection will be published by Akashic Books. It's called The Wishing Pool and Other Stories. And finally, after 7 years of writing and a year's delay, my next novel, The Reformatory, will be out in June. Thank goodness. Woo! I mean, it has been, and that is about a haunted reformatory and an unlikely friendship between one of the children locked up there and one of the ghosts.
Oh man, it reminds me of Casper and Devon Sawa. I'm a millennial, so don't worry about that. Do we have any questions out in the audience? We have at least one up here from Lori. We've got one back there as well. Let's start here.
All right, Victor, I was lucky enough to read the arc. That's my only comment. And I love the themes. But my question is, a lot of horror, I've read all of you in anthologies, and I think people miss out some of your writing if they're reading full novels and not anthologies. But how do you avoid the tropes in anthologies when there's a specific theme given?
That's a great question.
That's a great question.
Yeah, it is. In a weird way, what I think of is, I remember long ago I went on a trip, and I had one book with me, and it was the complete stories of F. Scott Fitzgerald, right? And what I noticed as you read through them, because he wrote well over 100 stories, and what you would see, I would look at like where they were published, and you would see one was published in, say, the Saturday Evening Post, one was published in one other place, and then a third place. And what I started to notice was a pattern that it would be essentially 3 stories that were kind of the same story, and he just published them in 3 different places, and he got paid 3 different times. And one of them was bad, one of them was okay, and one of them was a classic. And I kind of loved that he was just like, maybe this will work, maybe it won't, And so in a way, the thing I love about anthologies is because there's a theme, there's a way that I feel like I don't want to be too, like, don't overthink it is almost my feeling. if it's a bad one, people will skip to one of the good ones, and they just won't say anything to me. If it's a good one, I wrote a good one, you know? And so in a way, those things are actually kind of a license to try something and to be a little bold, I think. At least that's the way I look at them. And in that way, it takes a lot of pressure off personally. And then they pay you.
Yep. Does anybody else have an answer for that question?
I'll just jump in because I just yesterday turned in a short story for an anthology after a string of them. You know, deadline, deadline, deadline. Oh, and write 2 more stories for your collection, one after the other. And it is intimidating, you know, because you don't know how the story will turn out. You know, one of them might be the worst one you've ever published, but one of them might be the best one you've ever published. And when it comes to a themed anthology, I always try to do something a little bit different. But I think the thing that distinguishes the stories, or at least for me anyway, is, okay, there's the overarching whatever theme or premise that we're supposed to be following, but what is my personal fear in interaction with that theme? And as long as I keep it close to the personal, I mean, I don't want to call it a formula, but I have noticed that as I write, it starts with that personal fear, and then you amplify it up to 11 with some kind of fantasy element, because I'm not trying to re-traumatize myself or my audience, right? So the fantasy element is crucial. And there's usually grief or transgression that opens the door to the horror. I mean, when you really think of your favorite horror movies, Midsummer, Astor's other film, Hereditary, Nope, opens with grief. And you know, all those 80s slashers, if you smoke a cigarette or have sex, you're gonna get killed. So transgression, if I find a way to mix all those things together, then the story will pop out.
Moral turpitude is a death sentence in horror movies.
Yes.
For me, when I get invited to write, I've written now like 5 different short stories for horror anthologies. Whenever I get a chance to write for horror anthologies, I just take the tropes and, like you said, I turn them up to 50. So if it's a story like, I got a story in a book called Orphans of Bliss, which is about horror-themed addiction stories. So I was like, oh, well, maybe I'll write about zombies. I'll come up with something about zombies. Like, oh, I'll come up with zombies who are addicted to crack. And that brings them back. They're so addicted, they come back from the dead. And then, unfortunately, the dealer swallows a bag of crack. And, you know, zombies do what zombies do. And so I just turn it all the way up. Because with a short story, like Victor was saying, if somebody gets the anthology and they don't like it, they'll just go to the next one. You know, and I still get paid, so it's...
Right.
I don't know. Crack-eating zombies sounds like something I'm trying to read immediately.
That is up to 50.
Do we have someone back here?
First of all, thank you all for being here. It's been very inspiring to hear you. But my question is, with being a 7th grade teacher, I'm always looking for inspiration to inspire my children. So what inspired you when you were younger, this goes for all of you, to write fiction and to write horror?
I'll answer that real quick.
Go ahead.
Because I read a lot of books I had no business reading when I was in the 7th grade. So like my aunt had Salem's Lot. I've talked about it before. It's one of my favorite books. And the first time I read it, I was 12 years old, and my aunt had it on her table in her kitchen. And I said, "Can I have that?" And she was like, "I don't know. It's kind of scary." I said, "I'll be fine." I read that book, and I slept with a popsicle cross under my pillow for like a month. I knew Danny Glick was coming to my window. I was going to be prepared. But I think for me, that book was the first time I felt the power of an author. You know, the power that you have when you write a story. It's sort of the psychic connection between you and the reader, and that connection between me and Stephen King when I read that book. And so that inspired me. I wanted a bit of that power. I wanted people to feel that way about my books. So I went from Salem's Lot to Red Dragon to Silence of the Lambs to, you know, explains a lot about who I am today, I think. But it's like, but I think those stories inspired me that I wanted to tell my own stories, but just as you said, through my own prism. So.
Oh, me. Okay, so oddly, or maybe not so oddly, the book that, I mean, I always wanted to write. I was folding typing paper in half and drawing illustrations with captions from the time I was 4. Always knew I wanted to write, but I think the thing that made me realize that being an author was something I could be and have huge impact was Alex Haley's Roots. Because that's when I came of age. I mean, y'all don't even understand. The whole country was watching one show
Yeah.
at the same time. Black, white, everybody was watching this. Everybody was talking about this. And the fact that it was such a powerful story of my history, too. The horror part happened when Kunta's foot got cut off, and that's when I stopped reading the book, actually, because I had already seen the miniseries, like, well, I know where this is going. But in terms of the horror, and that's real-life horror, right? So the thing that goes hand in hand with that, then, is, you know, Papa Stephen King. I have to credit my mother, a civil rights activist, was a huge horror fan, I think because of her own personal traumas. And she gave me my first Stephen King novel, which was The Shining. And even though he's not writing about race, there's a black character in the book, but he's not writing specifically about race, those two things got kind of caught up together in my imagination. And then add Gloria Naylor with the example of a black woman who can write about the metaphysical and be respected.
Yes.
That was very important to me, to be respected as a writer. That was my triad.
And I would just add in, I mean, we've all mentioned him, Stephen King again, but the specific story I remember was a story called Survivor Type.
Oh, yes.
Which is just a great story about a doctor who is making sort of side money by using his little prop plane to fly cocaine back and forth between, I forget where in the Caribbean, and might be Florida.
Key West.
And, his plane crashes, and he's got a pallet of coke, and he's trying to figure out how to survive. And he realized there's nothing he can eat on the island or anything like that. And what he starts to figure out, because he's a surgeon, he starts to say, if I anesthetize myself, I can remove my foot, and I can eat my foot. And then he says, if I remove my fingers, I can eat my fingers. And essentially, it's the journal of him slowly cannibalizing himself, using the coke as an anesthetic, and how far. And the last line is like, I'm trying to figure out how far I can get up my legs. And I was probably 10 or 11 or 12, and that was the greatest catnip as a writer, because it was that feeling of just like, I can't believe you could do that. I'd read other books, of course, and maybe in a way I'd read the things that my mom or my teachers had said was the acceptable stuff, right? And what was so exciting about that story was I knew this was unacceptable, and that's why it was so good, you know? And so I feel like, I know there's ongoing conversations about, like, again, like I said earlier, what we protect our kids from and all the rest, but if a book like Skeleton Crew, Stephen King short stories, or Clive Barker's Books of Blood falls off the back of a truck in front of a 7th grade school, it's going to make a bunch of kids very happy. Right. And make a few writers.
True.
And you know, I haven't written horror or anything like that just yet, very much, or at least not published it or publicly. But I can say that I was. For me, it wasn't Stephen King. For me, it was actually movies and television shows. I was a kid who grew up watching Are You Afraid of the Dark on Nickelodeon, which was, you know, horror for kids. I was obsessed with all of the R.L. Stine Goosebumps books.
Yep.
You know, and people always say R.L. Stine is what you are into before Stephen King, but they forget the bump of Christopher Pike. When I was a kid, it's actually R.L. Stine to Christopher Pike and then to Stephen King, if you can't get your hands on some Stephen King at a very young age. So for me, it was mostly films. I was not in a home where there was a lot of censorship. So, you know, my grandpa let me watch From Dusk Till Dawn on pay-per-view. And I loved that movie. I was very, very into it. And I didn't get into horror literature until I was introduced to Edgar Allan Poe, who even then I was not actually introduced to because somebody gave me a poem or a book. I was introduced to him through the show Tiny Toons because they did a whole segment on Edgar Allan Poe and his raven who kept screeching nevermore. And that's how I knew who wrote that book when I saw it in the library. You know, and I think people can come to horror from a lot of different ways as a fan and also as a creator. And we're at a place now where, I mean, Stephen King, everybody knows. Everybody loves Stephen King. But some of us, you know, we get there. We don't start with Stephen King. Or you start with your grandma telling you wild stuff, like getting a drop of bleach on your skin will turn your whole body inside out, which is also a thing my grandma did to me. She was wild. Now that I'm thinking about it, did I like her? Yeah, I did. I have to admit I did. Do we have any more questions?
We have time for one more here
One
in the
more
back.
question here in the back, okay?
Well, now I have the pressure of being the last question. So I am an aspiring writer and also just an ally to the Black community. And you guys talk a lot about representation, and within my own writing, I want to do that in the best way possible. And so I'm just asking, like, what is the best way for white authors to write Black characters, or should white authors even write Black characters? And just what are your thoughts on that?
I think you should just read a lot.
Yeah.
I think you should read everything you can get your hands on, especially writing by Black authors. But I'd be
I agree.
love to hear anybody else.
Don't write caricatures, write characters. That's the main thing. You can write anything you want. You can write about anything you want. You know, I just finished a book where like 7 or 8, 15 to 18-year-old kids get killed. You can write anything you want, but you have to be prepared that not everybody's gonna like it. But if you write it authentically and truthfully, you know, then you can stand on that. You know, I wrote a book where 2 LGBTQ men get murdered. I'm not an LGBTQ man, but I did my best to write it authentically and honestly and represent the community in a way that was truthful and not generic. And part of that is talking to people from the community you want to write about. If you want to write about Black characters, find some Black friends. Not Black people that know you, Black people that are your friends, because that's 2 distinct things, you know? And so I think that's a part of it. But also, if you're writing from a place of truth, then you don't have to worry about anybody questioning that.
I agree.
I think that's good advice. I mean, I think it's just a risk, right? Like that's
is a
It's
risk.
just being open to the risk. And I would say the other part of it is like thinking of myself. And then when people you trust tell you what you got wrong, believe them, right? Like that's it. And then in the same way, like every once in a while, if I write a character who's not from New York City, I have to ask some people who are from like some friends from Montana, really help me out with this Montana book, because there were lots of things that I found I was just sensibility-wise, I was just getting wrong. And I was able to hear that and and then change what I was doing. And then even sometimes say, maybe I shouldn't be doing this, right? Like maybe what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna tell a different kind of story. And as was said, I'm gonna just read a bunch of Black folks and buy their books and go to their readings, and that's support too, you know?
Yeah, I think sensitivity readers are important.
Yeah.
And I wrote a story recently with a white protagonist for the Boston Review about a white woman who sees a Black child being arrested by police and decides to intervene and say something. It's called Say Something, right? And I actually had a white colleague as a sensitivity reader, you know, read my story, and she thought I was too easy on her. But I do think it's valuable. It's hard to reach out. I mean, it was hard for me to reach out to her. It's a little embarrassing almost on one level. But I think it's something that's very, very helpful to have people who can be sensitivity readers for you and give you valuable feedback. And then the second thing really quickly is maybe ask sometimes why you want a specific character to be of a certain ethnicity. Because I found when I was teaching that sometimes the character popped into the writer's mind as a Black woman or a Native American man specifically because it was fulfilling an unconscious trope for them. And that's the biggest issue, like even one where it was totally a trope. It was like a magical Native American, but to make that better, what's his life? Who does he care about? Who are his family members? You know, why is he so interested in what's going on with her? So you can take something that feels tropey and make it less tropey by expanding and humanizing those characters and their lives.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much for your questions.
And thank you,
Thank you for
Ashley,
being here.
for leading that.